Hello and welcome. Thank you all for joining us this evening. Our session is titled When the Safety Net Pays for Itself. What types of policies most improve societal well-being? This talk seeks to answer this through analysis of 133 economy policy changes in the US over the past half century. Professor Nathaniel Hendren will show that direct investments in low-income children have historically had the highest returns, in many cases paying for themselves in the long run. Nathaniel Hendren is a professor of economics at Harvard University and founding co-director of Opportunity Insights. His work is motivated by the question, do markets provide equal opportunity? Using a combination of theoretical and empirical analysis, Nathan documents and evaluates the potential for opportunity in various situations, including insurance markets and intergenerational mobility. His work seeks to understand when and why markets fail to provide opportunity, quantify the impact of these market failures, and provide tools to normatively evaluate potential policy solutions. In 2019, he was awarded the Presidential Early Career Award for Scientists and Engineers, having been nominated by the National Science Foundation. In his ongoing work with Opportunity Insights, he seeks to develop scalable policy solutions that will empower families throughout the United States to rise out of poverty and achieve better life outcomes. Nathan earned a BS in mathematics and economics from the University of Chicago and a PhD in economics from MIT. Without further ado, let's begin our discussion of when the safety net pays for itself. Nathan, the virtual floor is yours.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that gracious introduction. Is everybody okay to see the slides? All right. Title of the talk is When the Safety Net Pays for Itself. And I want to say at the outset, this is some work that I've been doing joint with a graduate student of mine, Ben Sprung-Kaiser, a graduate student here at Harvard, where the broad question we've been trying to grapple with is what government policies do the most to improve social well-being. So questions like, should we spend more or less on health insurance policies from the government? Should we raise top marginal income tax rates? Or maybe we should invest more in kids. And if so, at what age should we be targeting those investments? The motivation and the launch point for this work is that there's a large body of existing research in economics that analyzes the effects of many of these types of policy changes. But there's very little work quantifying the broad trade-offs across these different policy categories. And part of the reason for this is that within each of these different policy categories, there's often different normative tools for comparison. So for example, in education policies, researchers will often conduct a cost-benefit analysis of the policies they consider. In tax policies, people often construct these numbers they call the marginal cost of public funds. Or in, say, recent government policies that are aimed at saving jobs, they might calculate the cost per job saved. Or in health policies, you might calculate the cost per life saved. The use of these different metrics might be quite useful within policy categories, but it makes comparing across broad domains quite difficult. And so what we did in this work is conduct a unified welfare analysis of 133 historical policy changes in the United States over the past half century. We studied policy changes spanning 4 major categories: social insurance, education and job training, taxes and cash transfers, and in-kind transfers. For each policy change, we drew upon estimates from existing academic work to measure 2 numbers. First, the benefits that those policies had to their intended recipients, where we conceptualize that as how much were those beneficiaries willing to pay out of their own income for that policy change. And second, and what turns out to be even more important, is calculate the net cost to the government of the policy, where crucially, we think of not just the upfront expenditure on a given policy that we see today, but we also think of any long-run impacts that feed back onto the government budget over time. And as I'll walk you through, this is going to turn out to be a crucial distinction when measuring the actual cost associated with government policies. Having constructed each of those 2 numbers, we then take the ratio of those 2 to construct what we call the policy's marginal value of public funds. It measures for every dollar of net government cost that the government puts into the policy over the long run, what are the benefits to the beneficiaries of that policy? And so this is sort of a measure of the bang for the buck, or the bang for the government buck, of each policy change that we consider. And so how do we think about using this measure, this marginal value of public funds, to decide whether a policy is a good or a bad idea? Well, comparisons of the marginal value of public funds allow you to say something about the hypothetical desirability of budget neutral policies. So what do I mean by that? Imagine that we have two policies, call it policy 1 and policy 2. Policy 1, let's say, has a marginal value of public funds of 1. Policy 2 has a marginal value of public funds of 2. So at the face of it, policy 2 has a higher bang for the buck. And so if you say value resources equally to the hands of people who benefit from policy 2 as people who benefit from policy 1, then you would prefer policy 2 over policy 1. But you may not value resources equally in the hands of those two people. And so more formally, what we can say with these marginal values of public funds is that more spending on policy 1 financed by less spending on policy 2 increases societal well-being or social welfare, if and only if you would like to take $2 from policy 2 beneficiaries in order to give $1 to policy 1 beneficiaries. And so what's going on here is the MVPF, this marginal value of public funds, provides a unified measure of the trade-offs associated with each policy. It tells you how much benefit is provided to each beneficiary per dollar of government cost. And so you can put all policies on a level playing field to evaluate policies not only within domains, but across very broad domains. Now, at the end of the day, I want to emphasize that when you measure a marginal value of public funds, it doesn't mean that a higher marginal value of public funds is necessarily better. At the end of the day, you have to decide whether that return on the government spending is worth it for you. And that incorporates sort of your own preferences on whether or not, on how you see the beneficiaries of those policies in the broader scheme of your preferences. Now, there is one case that'll turn out to be quite important where we don't actually have to talk about trade-offs. And that's what we're going to call an infinite marginal value of public funds. That occurs when the policy delivers a benefit to the beneficiaries of the policy without actually costing the government any money in the long run. Now, the economic textbook example of this is when tax rates are really, really, really high and they go above what the top of what people call the Laffer curve, then you can have a situation of when you reduce taxes, you can have people increase their earnings in a way that actually makes the tax cut pay for itself. So you deliver a benefit to the beneficiaries in order and are able to actually provide a positive flow back to the government budget. Now, we'll debate in a second whether the empirical evidence actually suggests that can happen. But conceptually, that's what corresponds to a marginal value of public funds that is infinite. And importantly, what we're going to do is extend this idea that policies can pay for themselves, not just within tax policy domains, but also in education and health policies, et cetera. Okay, so that's the framework that I want you to have in mind to try to think about the desirability of different policies. And now our goal with our empirical work was to estimate each of these marginal value of public funds for all these 133 policies that I was telling you about. And I want to give you an example of how we do that in one case. And I'm going to pick an example here of admitting an additional student into college. This comes from a policy in Florida International University, which is a four-year institution in Florida that, fortunately for academic research purposes, uses a minimum GPA threshold as an admissions criteria to allow kids into their college. And what this does is create what we call a fuzzy discontinuity that allows you to see people just on one side of the discontinuity have a higher likelihood of being admitted into the school relative to people whose GPA falls just below this threshold. And in previous work, Seth Zimmerman utilized this discontinuity and followed kids on each of these sides of the discontinuity for 14 years after the time they were applying to college to look at what happened to their earnings over the long run. And just to summarize what he was able to find, you can see on this graph earnings on the vertical axis and the distance relative to that admissions cutoff on the horizontal axis. And you see that as your GPA crosses that admissions threshold, you're much more likely to be admitted into the school, and later on, you're likely to have higher earnings. Okay, so this is one of the 133 policies that we consider, and I want to show you how we think about translating this into the policy's marginal value of public funds. I'm going to start with the net cost to the government of admitting an additional student into Florida International University. Now, fortunately, there's great data on the cost that to the government of educating people in this school from iPads. And we know that an additional admission costs about $11,000. So this is lower than the actual cost of educating somebody in the school, because only about 30 to 35% of people that are admitted will actually enroll. So the net cost to the government just from this admissions is about $11,000. Now, students themselves contribute part of this. So they pay about $3,000 to the government to pay for a portion of their costs. But in addition, when we start to think about the net cost to the government, we have to think about where those kids would have gone had they not been admitted. And in Florida International, it's a school that often draws its students from draws students that would have otherwise gone to a two-year institution. That was and two-year institutions in Florida are also heavily subsidized by the government. And so when you admit a child into Florida International University, you're actually saving a bit of money that would have been spent on their education in a community college. And so we can estimate that the government saves about $5,500 per admit just from the reduction in community college spending that those kids would have incurred. And so the net upfront cost to the government of admitting a child into Florida International University is about $2,500. And that's before we even take into account any of the earnings impacts from admitting a kid into Florida International. And so what are the earnings impacts? Now, if we start to think about the long run effects of admitting somebody into Florida International, well, over the time when they're actually enrolled in Florida International, they're less likely to actually be working. And this has a real cost to the government. Those kids are no longer paying as much tax revenue to the government while they're enrolled in school. And we estimate that this costs about an additional $2,000 back to the government. But over the subsequent 9 years, those kids grow up to earn more money and therefore pay back more tax revenue back to the government. So by the time the kids are 33 years old, they've paid back over $7,000 in tax revenue, which is more than enough to offset the initial cost that the government incurred for getting them into Florida International. And so the net cost to the government is actually negative for this example. On average, the government's actually saving over $2,000. And so I didn't pick this example out of random. And this is an example. This is one of those cases where the policy provides benefits to those kids. They're presumably better off because they're admitted into a school that they would like to go to. And on net, it doesn't actually cost the government any money over the long run. It's a policy that, when thought of from the government as a whole, is actually paying for itself. All right. So this is one example of the 133 policies that we consider. I want to now show you the range of other policies that we consider. And the way I'm going to do this is I'm going to put on the horizontal axis of this graph the average age of each policy's beneficiaries. And then on the vertical axis, I'm going to put the marginal value of public funds of each of these policies. Now, I'm going to go up to about 5, and then I'm going to put the infinite policies, the policies that don't actually cost the government any money, on the green line up at the top. And so there you see Florida International University admitting kids around age 19 and having an infinite marginal value of public funds. So now what we can do is bring in all of the other policies that we considered in our analysis. And you can see these policies span policies like health policies, transfer policies, disability insurance policies, job training policies, nutrition, food stamps, things of that nature. What you see is that historically, policies that are making direct investments in children have had the highest marginal values of public funds. So what are we looking at here? So you can see here in yellow, these 4 dots here are the 4 major expansions of the Medicaid program in the United States over the last 50 years. And what you see is all 4 of them have very high marginal values of public funds. And in fact, 3 out of 4 of them are actually paying for themselves. We also see high marginal values of public funds for policies like preschool policies, which I think traditionally get a lot of attention in this space of having high returns. And indeed, we do see evidence that preschool policies have had historically high returns, things like the Abecedarian and the Perry preschool program. But also when you look to older ages, so expansions of spending in the K through 12 education system, on average, we estimate has actually paid for itself in the long run. We also see very high returns for policies that are expanding college access and increasing college attendance amongst kids. Now, in contrast, when we turn to policies targeting adults, we tend to not see as high of marginal values of public funds. We see lower values, generally ranging in the kind of 0.5 to 2 range. And again, that's not to say that those policies are bad policies. It just suggests that those policies involve trade-offs. It involves trade-offs of spending more money on one policy versus another when we're talking amongst policies targeting adults. But historically, these policies that have been making direct investments in children look like, if anything, they're having really, really high returns. Okay. Now, the one thing I do want to bring out in terms of caution when looking at this graph is that there is a lot of statistical uncertainty in any single one point on this graph. So here I'm going to show you what we call the confidence intervals there with those vertical lines, which shows you that, when you look at one of these dots, we can't be entirely certain about where it exactly lies on this graph due to the statistical uncertainty in these estimates. And so it's helpful to pool these estimates into broader category averages. And so that's what this graph is doing here. And what you can see is that for child education, for health policies targeting children, and for college policies for kids, on average, those policies have had very high MVPFs. And in contrast, the other categories targeting adults have traditionally had lower marginal values of public funds. And so what's going on here is that on average, government spending in these child-targeted policies has paid back more than its upfront expenditure. And so here what I'm plotting on the vertical axis is for every dollar that the government spends upfront, how much does it cost the government in the long run? And so if the policy was going to cost the government $1 in the long run, you'd see everything lined up here in between, right along the $1 line. But for policies targeting kids, on average, we see that they've paid back not only the upfront dollar that the government spent, but actually returned money to the government. So in fact, those 4 major Medicaid expansions to kids on average have paid back $1.80 for every dollar that was spent, for a net profit, in a sense, to the government of 80 cents. And in contrast, when we look at policies targeting adults, you tend to see that on average, when you do a policy that costs the government money, in the long run, it actually does cost the government money. Okay, so on average, we see really high returns to policies targeting kids. Now, I do want to highlight that that's not a universal theme. Not all child-targeted policies have high marginal values of public funds. So a few examples that I think are important to call out. One is the Massachusetts Adams Scholarship. So there's good work suggests, so Massachusetts Adams Scholarship provides a scholarship for in-state tuition to high-achieving students here in Massachusetts. But there's good evidence suggesting that that actually attracts students away from higher performing schools into schools that have lower graduation rates, and actually decreases the graduation rates of those kids, which on net over the long run actually ends up costing the government even more money because they grow up to have lower earnings. Similarly, there's a broad set of policies in the 1970s and 80s targeting expansions of job training programs. These programs historically in the 70s and 80s have not been very successful. And so this is showing you an estimate from Job Corps, which has a marginal value of public funds of around 0.2. Now, lastly, the third one there is the supplemental security income, which is disability insurance for 18-year-old kids. And so this, I think, this has an estimate at MVPF of about 0.9. And I think highlights the importance of not always saying that a low MVPF is necessarily bad. What this tells you is that for every dollar the government spends on supplemental security income for disabled 18-year-olds, it costs the government $1 to deliver 90 cents of benefits to those beneficiaries. And so that may very well be worth it. And in fact, for me, I think this is a policy that I would personally support, but it suggests that the policy has actual costs associated with it. It's not something that we get for free. It's a policy that for every dollar we spend, we deliver 90 cents of benefits. Now, the other thing I should mention is that for policies targeting adults, there are some policies that if you look at their estimates, it does look like they have fairly high returns. The one that has the highest is this top tax rate reduction from a marginal rate of 70% down to 50% that was enacted in 1981. And if you look at the research on that policy change, it suggests that that policy might have actually paid for itself because people increased their incomes in response to the tax rate reduction. However, that policy has an enormous amount of statistical uncertainty. So here I'm plotting you its confidence interval, and you actually can't reject that that has an MVPF of 1 or an MVPF of infinity. And so what this suggests is that kind of the canonical debates about whether or not tax cuts can pay for themselves, you could maybe find some evidence of this in existing literature, but by far the most robust evidence of historical policies that are paying for themselves are investments in kids, and in particular low-income kids. Okay. Now, that was all showing you policies through the lens of the age of the children or the age of the beneficiaries on the horizontal axis. Another classic debate that we face in society is whether or not to do more or less redistribution from rich to poor adults. And so what I'm plotting here on the horizontal axis is the incomes of the beneficiaries of different tax and transfer policies that have been changed over the last 50 years. And what you see here is on the far right are policies that affect the top marginal income tax rate. And then the other policies that you're seeing are things like the expansion of the earned income tax credit in 1986 and 1993. You can also see that Paycheck Plus dot on the far left is a randomized control trial trying to test an earned income tax credit to single adults without children. And so this is just plotting all of those marginal values of public funds. So why is this useful? Well, these numbers can help you put a quantification on whether or not you think additional redistribution is desirable. So what do I mean by that? Well, let's take the example of the 1993 Clinton tax reform. So what did Clinton do in 1993? Well, he increased the top marginal income tax rate, and he also expanded the earned income tax credit. And so here we have a marginal value of public funds for each of those two different components of that policy. The marginal value of public funds at the top tax rate increase is 1.85. The marginal value of public funds for the 1993 EITC expansion is 1.12. And so what does that mean? It means you would prefer the increase in the top marginal income tax rate to finance the expansion of the earned income tax credit, if and only if you would prefer to take $1.85 from a top earner in order to give $1.12 to someone who is on the EITC. All right. And so the MVPF just helps you quantify those trade-offs in the context of tax policies, but also beyond tax policies. Now, that is for redistributing through the tax code. It suggests that if you take estimates from the existing literature, it looks like it's costly to redistribute from the top of the income distribution down to the bottom of the income distribution. But that's statically within adults. And I think the key takeaway that I want to provide to you is that if you expand the sets of policies you consider for redistribution, not just within adults, but also to think about making investments in low-income children, you no longer see these types of trade-offs. So what I've done here is just add all of the policies making direct investments in children, and you can see you no longer face that kind of increasing slope here. There's a lot of policies targeting low-income kids that have very, very high returns. And so in this sense, historically, it's been more efficient to redistribute intergenerationally as opposed to statically within generations. Now, finally, you might ask, I told you we covered policies over the last 50 years. How has this changed? Have we taken advantage of these policies and the returns to child policies have declined over time, or have they remained stable? So what I'm plotting for you here are the average marginal values of public funds for policies targeting kids and policies targeting adults for each of the last five decades. And what you see is consistently high returns for policies targeting kids. And so what this means is that historically, we've had high returns for investing in kids, and for policies that have been enacted more recently, they've had very high returns if they are targeting kids, and in particular, low-income kids. And so that's the set of evidence that I wanted to bring to bear about whether or not the social safety net pays for itself. I think historically, when you look at the sets of policies that have been enacted over the last 50 years, direct investment in low-income children have had the highest, often infinite, marginal values of public funds. We find lower marginal values of public funds for policies targeting adults. And we find that it's costly to redistribute from rich to poor adults. But if you expand that focus to direct investments in the children in those families, it's historically been the most cost-effective method of redistribution. And so that's what I wanted to talk through at the outset here. And I'm looking forward to a discussion with all of you and your questions and thoughts. I just want to leave you, for those of you that are interested in exploring, this was obviously only scratching the surface of the analyses of the different 133 policies. All of these are available at policyinsights.org. And so with that, looking forward to turning it over to your questions and looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Nathan. Let me just start with one. So the next governor of Massachusetts, we'll say, whoever succeeds to Governor Baker at some point, calls you in and says, where should I put my money? Based on this, take it all out of DOL and give it all to the Department of Education, or perhaps a little more granular than that. What's your concise advice for a governor?
So I think for a governor and at the national level as well, I think investments in K through 12 and college education have historically been some of the highest returns. So expanding access to universities, I think we also need to make sure that, I gave the example of the Adams Scholarship, and I don't want to go too negative on the Adams Scholarship, but I think that's a policy where it only provides benefits for people that go to in-state colleges. And I think we want to think about expanding the horizon and the ability for people to go to the best colleges that they can attend, and the ones that'll deliver the best benefits for them over the long run. I think at the state level, Medicaid policies, access to healthcare, I think there's a growing body of evidence that in particular, when you make sure that every child has access to healthcare, those policies in the long run, while they might cost money up front, those kids grow up to have lower healthcare costs back on the Medicaid system, and when they're teenagers and when they're young adults, they grow up to have higher earnings as adults, and all those benefits flow back to all of us as taxpayers. So even beyond the desire that I think we would all share to provide quality healthcare just in the interest of making sure everybody is healthy, the true way to think about the costs and benefits of that just makes it a no-brainer to be making really high investments in those areas.
So this is the compound interest. The earlier you put the money into the account, the more return you get out of the end.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think, that's not to say that college policies are pretty good too. And in fact, the benefit of those policies is they reap the benefits pretty quick. And so if anything, there's pretty good returns if you want to make a quick dollar, so to speak, as a government, investing in college is a pretty good path. But you're right, those early investments can be quite beneficial over the long run as well. And as those kids go throughout their lives, they continue to pay back those benefits.
Let's push on the college example because of the question that's been raised here. Let's imagine hypothetically that everyone goes to college. Mm-hmm. Can we imagine that it would eventually get harder for each individual to get a job that fully utilizes their degree, and then therefore there's going to be this point of diminishing returns and people are making less money and paying less taxes? So how do you think about network effects of those kinds in your work?
Absolutely. So there's two directions that bias could go. I think one, as you mentioned, it could be that when an additional person goes to college, they're sort of taking a job away from somebody else who was already going to college. And so now there's a kind of a negative earnings effect on other people, and negative spillover, if you will, from admitting somebody into college. Flip side is, you might imagine, when you have a more educated workforce, that person could be in an environment that goes on to make inventions and creates additional ideas that spurns additional job creation. And I think there's a a body of empirical work that tries to look at both of those effects. And I think if anything, the kind of total body of work seems to point to the idea that expanding education seems to have positive spillovers. But the answer to how we are actually accounting for this is we're not accounting either side of this. And I think that comes back to our goal was to really try to take high quality empirical research that gets really solid empirical estimates for the policy in question. And in a sense, you can think of the policy, the Florida international policy I was giving you, as sort of admitting one more kid to college. And so it's sort of a small kind of marginal policy. As you expand it up, you would really want to think about those spillover effects and think about the bigger returns. But I think that comes back to thinking about historically, how have the returns to child policies changed over time? If we think that kind of building up this stock of investment in kids is following that pattern of diminishing returns, then I think we would have expected to see diminishing returns in the marginal values of public funds over time for policies invested in kids. But historically, that's not what we've seen. If anything, it looks like it's been going quite strong.
Very good. But I do need to ask, partly because we've already added into questions here, the confidence intervals are so high. I mean, is it fair to say it's difficult to measure the true return on most government programs? I mean, how confident can we be in these results?
Yeah, so I think I tried to show you some of the confidence intervals for historical policies. I think splitting them up for each of the 5 decades, you do end up with wide confidence intervals. But you can be quite confident that historically, policies that have invested in the healthcare of kids, their education, both the K through 12 and also in college policies, that on average those have returned a pretty substantial sum of money back to the government, and it looks like they've paid for themselves. Now, is there a lot of uncertainty in any given point that you see on that graph? Absolutely. And I think that's something that is often under discussed in general when we talk about evidence-based policymaking. I think there's sort of 2 sides of the coin here. What we did is we tried to take the universe of what is known about each of these different policies from the past 50 years of literature and then put it into the equations to show you what that uncertainty in that work looks like. And you're right, there is uncertainty in those in each of those different dots. I think what you can say there's not uncertainty in is that on average, historically, when we've made investments in kids, they've paid for themselves. Now, does that mean that it's going to happen for all of the future policies that we do? No. Does that mean for a given policy, if you're really interested in that policy, that one is paid for itself? Then, no, you might have to put a bigger confidence interval on that and be a little bit careful. But this is, in a sense, the extent to which we can grasp from the existing studies on what we know about the returns of those policies.
Fair enough. Let's extend then about low-income children policies. Tom Arrington raises a question. Lottery funds. So using the state of Georgia, for example, if lottery funds are used to pay for higher education, and those who are, the median income of those buying lottery tickets is lower than the median income of households sending kids to Georgia universities, should lottery funds be used to pay for education funding? Is that good or bad public policy? That's
a good question. So I would love to have the marginal value of public funds of lottery tickets. And I think, we need to know the cost, how much government revenue do they get from them, and like what's the benefit that individuals get from playing the lottery. And then we'd also have to have that debate about whether or not that's a benefit we would want to ascribe to them, or whether or not we think they're being duped, so to speak. The short answer is I don't have that marginal value of public funds. The way that we are thinking about this is to split those 2 pieces. 1, how is the policy financed? And 2, what is the policy actually doing? So I'm showing you the MVPFs for the expenditure side of that policy. But if it was combined with a tax policy, that would be a separate MVPF that we just don't actually have an estimate for. Now, I think I share the intuition that using a policy that imposes costs on, say, low-income parents in order to finance investments in their kids, sort of conscripting that through the government, may not be the best way to go here, primarily because you might be concerned that when you have a policy targeting low-income parents, they might, as a result of that policy, invest less in their own kids, right? And so I don't have the lottery example on that, but that would certainly be something that I would want to have a sense of. And if anything, what this suggests is that if you do the accounting right, you don't have to have the lottery, right? If you're actually paying for this out of the future tax revenue that the government gets as a result of a state choosing to invest in their kids, then you don't have to fund it out of lotteries. You fund it out of the future tax revenue that we all get at the federal government. And so that, I think, plays into this kind of fundamental problem that a lot of times the investments are done maybe at the state level, but the benefits are reaped at the federal level. And obviously, to get that to work, you'd have to have the federal government returning those funds back to cover the costs that are incurred at the state level, or enacting some type of fiscal federalism system to make that happen.
Well, so there's both there's a state versus federal level problem, but there's also a time problem.
There's
money from a lottery ticket today paying for college education the last 4 years, et cetera.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, when I say pays for itself, obviously we're looking over the long run. All of the returns that I was showing you are discounted at a 3% real interest rate. Nowadays, with the interest rates down around 1%, these policies look even better going forward, if you think of these as having the similar returns going forward. But there's a lot of reasons to think that we might be concerned about financing it out of future revenue. But this suggests that if you're pricing bonds using the historical evidence that we have on these policies, investing in the low income kids of the United States would be a pretty good bond to sell, and we should be making those investments, and we wouldn't necessarily have to pay for them today.
Very good. For those of you just joining us, we are talking with Professor Nathan Hendren, talking about when the safety net pays for itself. We do invite your questions on the Q&A at the bottom of the Zoom window. Let me ask you, when you were doing the research, were you surprised by any of the results? Anything that leaped out at you?
So I think certainly the child patterns were the ones that were the most surprising. I don't think we went in thinking that these policies might look like they would pay for themselves. But I think we talked a lot about that. I think the other surprising thing is that when you look at historical policies making transfers towards adults, you might have thought that giving a kind of tax benefit or a job training program to adults would kind of help them get on a better track, and that there'd be a good body of work sort of suggesting, oh, well, you can actually help somebody today and it'll help them off into the future. Historically, it looks like that doesn't happen as much with adult targeted policies relative to child targeted policies. The time to really invest is really when kids are young, up through college age. But once they get past that, the types of policies that are really having the high returns seem to be really few and far between. And I think that was pretty surprising to us, that you really didn't see as much of policies in that domain for the policy targeting adults.
What about what for me was surprising, the outlier result, job training programs for late teens, that sort of thing. Certainly we know that those who have job training programs tend to have lower net incomes over time than college educated on average, but it is a strikingly lower on your graph. So again, a surprise, or exactly what you expected?
Yeah, no, this is a surprise, because these are policies that you would have thought were actually a form of education, right? You're teaching somebody how to do a job, supposedly. And the difference in those graphs is not the levels of earnings of people that go through job trainings programs are lower than people that go to college. The differences that you're seeing on that graph are the fact that the returns to going to college. So had you not gone to college, but then sort of stayed on the same trajectory that you would have otherwise been in, just aside from not going to college, versus you're somebody who's on a track and thinking about a job training program, and you get into the job training program versus you don't. Those are the two comparisons that we're making. And it's about the impact that each of those programs have on people's life trajectory. You see a smaller impact for the historical job training programs that have been enacted in the 70s, 80s, and early 90s. Though one thing I would say about job training programs is that there are a couple more recent ones. I think my favorite is the Europe programs, are these things called sectoral training programs that really focus on helping people kind of get a direct pipeline into a particular kind of professional type of job. So teaching people how to work in call centers or other types of things where you can kind of identify that clear path, where they partner with employers and then they help people kind of get on that trajectory. The Year Up program, we actually think, is one of the policies that kind of bucks the trend in the job training category, and looks like it's doing quite quite well. And I think this kind of sectoral model of job training programs seems to do better than the historical ones like Job Corps, which looks like it's not been doing very well. And so that has pretty big implications because Job Corps gets a lot more money from the federal government than does these other sectoral training programs.
Interesting. I want to come back to job training, but let's stick on college for a second. What do you think about student loan debt cancellation? I mean, does your research suggest that this is an approach that the Biden administration should be following?
No. I mean, so if you think of student loan, a few things on student loans, and I guess I'll maybe go beyond the estimates a little bit. Student loan forgiveness could have a big benefit to individuals who have a lot of debt. I think on the face of it, has to be true. But it won't change the investments necessarily that they've already made in their education, right? So if I say, I'm going to give you $50,000 of student loan forgiveness, how much would you think how much would the benefits be of that policy? Well, it's likely to be about $50,000 to those individuals. And how much is it going to cost the government? Well, it's about $50,000. And so when you think about the graphs I was showing you, what would you expect that MVPF to look like? It's going to be around 1. And so maybe you want to do that if you really value giving benefits to people who have student debt. And I can think of a lot of reasons that would be reasonable. Then you might find that as a reasonable policy. But if you look at the suite of policies that we could be spending resources on, if you think of food stamps on there, we had a 1.8. Historical investments in kids were infinite, and so you could either put money into student loan forgiveness, which will have about a dollar for dollar kind of bang for the buck, or you could do policies targeting kids and get a much higher return. And so policy choices are always about trade-offs, and I think the idea with debt forgiveness is that it would most likely give a windfall gain. And the other piece, I think there's some mixed evidence. I think you want to have a sense of kind of who are the people with debt. Is it sort of progressive or regressive? I think we certainly know that people who are from more affluent backgrounds are much more likely to go to college, and people that go to college on average have higher earnings. But it is true that the people that have a lot of debt tend to not, conditional on going to college, tend to have lower parental income backgrounds. So, I do think there's complications with thinking about kind of these trade-offs, but at the end of the day, the bang for the buck of those policies is not going to be anything close to the high bang for the bucks that we see for policies that are making direct investments in kids or in many of the other social safety net policies that we already have.
And so how do you respond to those who say, well, but you're looking at a pretty binary trade-off, it's about bang for the buck. What about other factors? Are those factors ones is there a sort of ready way to figure out the criteria for other factors, or is that just left to the policymakers to decide?
Yeah. So I think the one factor that I can't tell you about is sort of how much do you value the beneficiaries of each of these different policies? Do you value, $1 in the hands of somebody that has a lot of student debt more or less than $1 for somebody that is on food stamps? That's a trade-off that I can't, that I'm not going to try to answer in this kind of work. But what I can do is quantify those trade-offs. And in quantifying it, we do want to think broadly about the benefits that the policy has. And so, in those estimates that I was showing you, a lot of those policies are doing things like expanding your life expectancy. And that's a tough thing to incorporate into a benefit, but we do it. We put, cold economists will put values on people's lives. And when we see a 1% or a 6-month increase in life expectancy, we can put a monetary value on that, and that's in those estimates. And I think that's trying to take a very expansive way, an inclusive way of the sets of benefits that we include in a policy's impact. But at the end of the day, what we can't resolve is sort of the trade-offs of if this group benefits versus this group benefits. That's a political question and a social question what we're trying to do is really quantify the trade-offs that you have available.
Well, fair enough. Let's try a different way to extend it. How comfortable would you feel extending your work to this notion on marginal value of public funds to different analysis beyond social programs? So the value of a strike fighter program versus increasing biodiversity, et cetera. How would you extend beyond the social programs area?
Well, you just captured two areas that are very difficult to measure the benefits, right? What's the benefit of national defense? that's a pretty tough measure. Conceptually, we'd want to think of the benefits to everybody, say in the country, of that national defense, or benefit or cost in some sense, and sum it up. And that would just be the benefits that that policy provides. And then you want to think of the net costs of that policy. And in principle, that's not there's not a conceptual problem with including it. The difficulty arises in actually measuring those benefits and measuring those costs. And the categories, the four categories that we talked through, are places where the economics literature has advanced greatly in constructing plausible estimates of what these policies do. And that enables us to then take those estimates and translate them into these numbers that allow us to make these comparisons. And conceptually, there's nothing that prevents one from doing national defense or the value of biodiversity, but it just makes it's more difficult because of both the lack of empirical evidence that's out there and the breadth of types of benefits that you might need to include in order to do an accurate job of measuring it.
So fair enough. Then what are the areas that you are itching to get to expand into?
Sure. So I think you can do macroeconomic policy. So I think we've seen things like the PPP or the UI expansions, the stimulus benefits. I think there it becomes more clear that there's a body of existing macroeconomic work to think about the pros and cons of these different policies that you can fit right into this framework. I think there's other policies in the space of regulations where you can think of, we were just quantifying things like the implicit trade-off embodied in the 93 Clinton tax reform of redistributing from rich to poor. What is the implicit trade-off associated with that reform? But I think you can do that for other policies like the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, and think about the implicit trade-offs that are associated with those policies and ask whether or not those trade-offs look similar to what we see in other policies or different, and then why. And I think this type of an approach of focusing on kind of the returns to these different groups of these different policies can be expanded into those domains as well.
Helpful. I just want to remind everyone that the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen is the place to put in your questions. We have just about 10 minutes, a few minutes more left. So it's time to give your questions over to Professor Hendren. Opportunity Insights is all about not just aggregate analysis, but about helping people understand economics and think about effects on policy. So how is your research being shared with policymakers? Are they beating down your door? Are you, standing in their lobby hoping to talk to them? Like how are you interacting with policymakers?
So I think it's a mix. I mean, I think the most common way that we interact with folks in the political sphere is to try to publish our work. And when it's covered, it's politicians are like people and they read the news. I think, we have had the benefit of talking with folks, especially at the local level. So a lot of our work at Opportunity Insights looks at granular policies kind of on the ground and measures of things like intergenerational mobility at very local levels that has given us a window into kind of the workings of people in mayoral offices and governor's offices and things like that. And there, I think it has been beneficial to us to have some discussions with folks about sort of the nature of economic opportunity in those areas and what they might be able to do about it. I think, like many, I think we're excited about the path forward in politics more generally and the support for evidence-based policymaking. I think it's been a long road over the last certainly 4 years, but I think is something that seems to have been highlighted in the kind of initial days here of the next administration of focusing on things like expanded data access for folks that are interested in trying to understand what policies are doing to the economy and how we might make better decisions with it. And hopefully we'll be a beneficiary like others with that.
Fair enough. Let me ask you a couple of questions that's getting the details of your work or particular kinds of policy. It's about food security specifically. Are there, what's ways to best invest in food security? School breakfast and lunch, payments to parents and guardians, policies that you might have looked at in that area?
So I think there's good evidence that both the WIC program, so that was a estimate in the 133, where you see evidence when you provide WIC, it increases birth weight of kids. Pretty good evidence that then suggests those kids go on to have substantially better lives, and that changes the cost benefit equation of providing those benefits to those kids when they're young. Similarly, on the food stamp program, it's great work by Hilary Hoynes and others finding evidence over the long run when you provide food stamps to people, their kids grow up to have better outcomes, lower incidence of kind of chronic conditions, higher earnings, and it ends up changing again the kind of cost benefit equation of things like food stamps. Now, food stamps is not just a direct investment in kids. It also, provides benefits to the parents as well. And so I think consistent with that, we find lower MVPFS for kind of food stamps. That's not infinite, but it is high. And I think the growing body of evidence suggests it might even be higher than what we've estimated. But I think the thing that I would take away is that direct investments look like they have the highest returns. And so we don't have the school breakfast program or the school lunch program estimates in our work because of partly because of the lack of the empirical work on it. But my gut would say, if you were to extrapolate from the estimates that we have, that those types of direct investments are the ones that tend to have the highest returns. That they go directly to the kids who are in need, and we see that there's pretty high returns for those investments.
Well, here's a related question then. How do we ensure the policy that best bolsters societal well-being are human-centered in nature, i.e. readily usable and helpful to those relying on them without bureaucratic barriers, like having to be filtered through an agency, having to pull your kid out of school to go to a certain office, et cetera? So I guess it's a two-part question. So are you seeing a pattern in your work that would suggest that this is a limiting factor? And second, if so, what can one do about it?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think anybody that's tried to look at a TANF application and try to fill it out just sort of screams at the world, right? It's an incredibly difficult process to apply for a broad set of benefits in the United States. Even unemployment insurance is not all that easy. I think, so I wouldn't say that we have evidence on kind of the cost of imposing those hassles. What I would say is that I think there's a set of programs out there that have started to have high returns. Let's take kind of job training, for example. I think historically, if you compare the Job Corps program to the Year Up program, I think one of the core goals of a program like Year Up is to really treat the participants with a pretty heavy amount of dignity and respect. And I think the programs that do that, government programs that treat people with greater respect, you do see things, at least in the job training type comparison, you see a higher return. Now, what would happen if we made TANF more accessible, or if we made food stamps more accessible? I don't have that particular policy variation to speak to, but my gut says that I think there's a kind of over demonization of folks that are getting benefits, and certainly when those benefits are flowing to their kids, I think we want to try to think differently about the barriers we're putting up to getting access to those programs.
Let's extend that. This is on both the workforce skills side, but also the access side. Are you seeing in policy the last 10 or 20 years something that suggests increasing barriers from digital access? That is to say, those who don't have digital access to applying for jobs or digital skills are being more and more left behind?
That's a good question. So I think, I don't have anything that would speak directly to that.
Sure.
There's a body of work suggesting a lot of people are not actually claiming for benefits that they're actually kind of eligible for, things like EITC benefits, food stamps, things of that nature. And certainly you would expect that as things go more electronic, the people that have access to the electronics are not necessarily the ones that are going to benefit from being able to kind of find out more information about, hey, if you could file if you filed your taxes, you would just get this EITC refund. So I think, that's a long-winded way of saying that a lot of the technological advances have not been on helping people get access to kind of benefits that are kind of rightly theirs. Again, how much of that is feeding into this, I can't say, but I kind of share the idea that it's on the technological side, we haven't made access to government benefits an easier thing to get over time.
We probably have just covered a couple more questions. This is one that's a little more, we're asking you to take what you've seen in the past and apply it to something that's proposed for the future. But a question comes up about the Family Security Act, proposed by Senator Romney, to provide parents with monthly allowances based on the number and age of children they have. Based on what you've seen, would you A, recommend for or against, and B, diagnose or project?
Yeah. Okay. So this is a tough one because I've got to go out a bit on a limb. But I'll tell you what the key thing in my mind is for whether or not that policy is going to have a higher or a lower return. And I think it's really about how much of the money that goes to the parents then feeds into a marginal expansion in the investment in the kids. And I think we don't know that. You can look historically. I was showing you a bunch of policies targeting lower income families. And I think there's good evidence to suggest that a lot of these policies have high returns that spill over onto their kids. You see that in the expansions of food stamps. You see pretty good evidence of that in the earned income tax credit policies. But you also see things like the negative income tax experiment, where it goes the other way, where you don't see positive impacts on kids. And so the evidence is a bit mixed on the extent to which, when you give direct benefits to parents, how much of that ends up feeding through to the kids. And I think that's the fundamental question here. And I think, the extent to which that feeds into the kids is going to be something that drives up that kind of return to the policy. I think there's a lot of reasons to support the policy, even if it doesn't have a high return, because you would like to ensure that those families are not living in poverty. And I think that's a perfectly reasonable reason to prefer that policy. It's just not necessarily, it's a policy that then you might have to also be increasing taxes or cutting back on other programs in order to fund it. The extent to which that's true just depends on how much of that flows into the kids. And I think from my perspective, the key thing that I would like to have a sense of, or a better sense of, is how much of that is going to spill over into improved outcomes for the kids in the future. And I think the evidence probably leans towards there's a positive effect on those kids, but I think there's a lot of uncertainty in that.
I'm going to tell you one more question, and I'm going to ask you to do a quick promo before we go. Last question. What is the most effective way to succeed in implementing policies that pay for themselves? Again, last piece of advice to a policymaker, like what's going to make a difference?
So I'm going to give a very high-level answer to that, because I think the thing that's really missing in the United States is better coordination between the federal and local governments. And it comes back to what we were saying before. All of those investments, almost all of those investments in kids that had really high returns, were made by actors at the state and local level. And the benefits flowed back to the federal government. And I think we've had a system, a federal type system in the United States, where those benefits don't flow back then to the people that are actually making those investment decisions. And I think historically that leads to underinvestment. You end up with things like in Alaska, they use their dividend fund to pay back checks as opposed to invest in their colleges. And I think those types of trade-offs, when viewed at the state level, look differently than if you view them through the lens of the United States as a whole. And I think we really need to rethink the way in which educational investments and investments in kids is done at the state and local level and incentivized by the federal level.
Very good. Nathan, I want to give you, before we go, I want to give you 30 seconds to say opportunity insights. Why should people look at the site? What will they find there, et cetera?
Oh, well. So this is, as you've been alluding to, this is one of a broad set of many projects we have at Opportunity Insights. We've got work at opportunityinsights.org looking at real-time tracking of the economy going through COVID. We've been measuring intergenerational mobility and upward mobility prospects across every census tract in the United States at the Opportunity Atlas, and a large body of work done by my colleagues looking at the role of colleges in promoting upward mobility. And we're hoping to continue to be expanding that body of work to think about what can be done to improve economic opportunity and what types of policies are the best to help promote social mobility. And so that's what we're trying to do at Opportunity Insights, and certainly would encourage everybody to come take a look and be in touch.
I strongly recommend those who have not visited the site yet, you should definitely do so, because you can spend many a happy hour looking at all the data and playing with the models and really getting into the economic data yourself. Well, thank you so much, Nathan. You've been very kind with your time, and thanks to all of you who have joined us today. We hope you join us soon for our next signature event. Information on upcoming events, as well as recordings of past ones, can be found at socializeremotely.harvard.edu and at vpal.edu. harvard.edu/events. Good night, everyone, and thank you for joining us.